Steve Gardner, his weekly spot, does a great job covering baseball for USA Today. Fantastic follow on Twitter as well. Kind enough to join us on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Steve, how you doing, pal?
I'm good, Rich. How are you?
I'm doing well. Can you, for the listening audience, explain to me why all of a sudden the Washington Nationals decide now we're going to wave the white flag, but yet you don't do that at the trade deadline?
I think they felt like at the trade deadline that there was still some magic left in the team. They'd be able to summon that and, put everything aside that's happened for the previous 4 months of the season and kick it into gear over the final two. And it hasn't happened. We've seen, them lose to the Miami Marlins at 12-1 loss. I think was terribly demoralizing on Sunday. And, when that happens, I think that was the catalyst that kicked them into maybe not sell mode or fire sale mode, just the realization that it may not happen this year and they have to start thinking about next year.
So how does a guy, and again, explain to us, with the revocable waivers, with Harper being claimed on that, and I guess I was reading these reports. It was reported, I guess, the Dodgers missed a deadline to pick him up. I mean, give a little clarification on that, because I just find it hard to believe that they're going to let a player like that slip through the cracks.
Well, one of the things when you put it, and generally most every player is put on waivers at some point, or after the trade deadline, just to gauge, because teams want to gauge, if there's any interest in them, and they want to see, I think, which teams want to claim players, which teams may bluff and try and claim players to block other teams. It's like intelligence gathering. That said, Bryce Harper was one of those that was put on waivers. The Dodgers apparently did claim him, and what happens then is the Nationals have options of, one, they can just let Harper go and let the Dodgers take his salary and claim the player. Two, they could work out a trade where the Nationals could trade with only the Dodgers. Or three, they pull him back off waivers and keep him on their team for the rest of the season. That's what happened, the last option. But I don't know that anybody was really serious in the Dodgers about trying to make a trade. Harper obviously is more valuable than somebody who's not on the 40-man roster, which is basically the players that you can trade during the waiver period. And it was one of those where, I think the Dodgers also might have blocked Harper possibly going elsewhere. So it was one of those that I think a lot more of a big deal is made about it, but in reality, it wasn't that big of a story.
Yeah, no, I agree as well. Now, Murphy, I was a little surprised, too. They moved Murphy. And I understand he's had some of the injuries. He's not the same player, but even that month when he's healthy, he's a professional hitter. He's going to get on base. He hits for average, and he goes to a team that he absolutely destroyed in the postseason a couple of years ago for the Mets. So that's a good pickup by the Cubs.
Yeah, I think so too. And, Murphy, like Harper, is going to be a free agent at the end of the season. So if the Nationals realize they're not going anywhere and they can get somebody, which they did get a minor league prospect from the Cubs, then I think for them that was an opportunity to maybe make that and salvage something. And as Mike Rizzo said in his press conference, gain a little bit of payroll flexibility of, the Cubs picking up the last, $5 million or so that's left on Murphy's contract the rest of this year.
Look, I think with a month plus to go in the season, they're pretty much done. I think Pittsburgh's done. There's teams that we know are just done. And then you look at the Phillies last night. That's as demoralizing a loss. I mean, it seems as though it's commonplace. We've said that about this club. They bounce back typically, but that's a crippling loss. And I think the problem is, we go back to our conversation a couple weeks ago. Which team is just going to start to separate themselves and maybe have that late stretch of games where they're winning 5 out of 6, 6 out of 7? The Phillies, they're going backwards. They haven't played good baseball in the last several weeks. They've lost 4 in a row now. They're trying to avoid getting swept by the Nationals. And then conversely, the Atlanta Braves have won a couple games in a row, and I think they've won 7 out of the last 10, and they're starting to distance themselves. But that's as brutal as a loss as you can have if you're a Phillies fan last night.
Yeah, at this time of year, any of those close losses become maybe more demoralizing than they would in April or May. And the thing is, the Phillies have won a lot of those close games this season. 10 games over 500, and they've scored pretty much exactly the same number of runs that they've allowed. So they've been, you can say fortunate, you can say they've been skillful or clutch or whatever. Last night was the opposite of that, and it was a very tough loss to stomach now that they've lost 2 in a row to the Nationals.
All right, Josh and I have been going back and forth with this Cy Young Award debate here in the NL. I think I looked at DeGrom's numbers, and I know it's easy to look at the wins and losses of some of these pitchers, and I get some pitchers are innings eaters, and they compile a ton of innings like the Scherzers of the world. But for what DeGrom has done for a historically bad team this year after an 11-1 start, which is, I mean, how light years away that start was for the Mets. His ERA, I go back to Kershaw a couple years ago, who had a 1.69 ERA, and Scherzer had a 2.69, I believe, that year, and won it based on the fact that he won 20-plus games. I think sometimes we overvalue the wins and losses, and we kind of undervalue ERA. And DeGrom has not only he's basically saying every time I go out there, I'm the sole reason I'm keeping my club in the ball game. Like, I would give, if I had a vote, I would say he's a Cy Young Award winner.
I'll tell you, it's for me, it's too close to call right now. And with essentially now both of these teams out of the playoff race, I don't know that you can make a huge stride in leading your team to a playoff that a lot of the baseball writers like to factor in. I think when you talk about the Kershaw versus Scherzer year, I think maybe not so much the wins, it's the innings pitched too. And I think that's a bigger advantage. Now, with both of those guys are right about in the same ballpark. 168 innings for DeGrom, 174 for Scherzer. So, I mean, yes, you've got them pretty close. You know, they're walks and hits plus innings pitched about the same. Scherzer's a little better. Scherzer's got a few more strikeouts. DeGrom with the ERA. I think there are so many different things, you know, that there's a fine line between the two, that at this point you can go either way. And I wouldn't, you know, be upset if DeGrom ends up winning it. I wouldn't be upset if Scherzer. I don't think there's a gross miscarriage of justice at this point between the two, you know, no matter who wins it.
Well, you mentioned the innings pitch. Going even back to that year, then I can turn around and say, well, you could have really gave it to Lester. You know, Lester had 26, I think, less innings pitched. Not a ton more strikeouts. Maybe that was the issue. But he was also 19-5 and had a lower ERA. I just found it remarkable that year Kershaw's ERA was 1.69, and it was a run lower than Scherzer. See, I don't – to me, this is just me, when a pitcher has the type of year that DeGrom has had, I think it's tough to gauge if you're going to vote for him just purely based. I think you throw wins and losses out of the window, especially when it comes to this type of ERA. And I know some writers don't see that.
Right, and I think we sort of crossed the bridge a little bit when Felix Hernandez won the AL Cy Young Award and won, 13 games that year. I think that's when we started to say, okay, yeah, wins are a flawed statistic. Let's look at the entire body of work. Let's look at other stats, you know, their ERA, their WHIP, their strikeouts, their innings pitched, you know, look at WAR even, that sort of thing. I think one of the other things, too, and maybe it shouldn't play into things, but, you know, Max Scherzer offensively has been pretty good, which, you know, he's hitting close to 300 this year. And, yes, it's a pitching award, so maybe that would factor more in if it were MVP. But so many things that Scherzer does well, I think he's so competitive in all categories that's what makes him so good, and that's why he's won a couple already.
Couple minutes on a Thursday. Steve Gardner joining us from USA Today. Does a wonderful job covering baseball. Great follow on Twitter as well. Kind enough to join us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, as he does a weekly spot every Thursday. If you are the Boston Red Sox, and we talked about this with Chris Sale, okay, you're going to stick him on the shelf. Maybe you just want to be cautious. And now all of a sudden, by his own admission, he knows that he's not fully healthy. How much, you know, concerned should you be as a Red Sox fan, especially when a pitcher of his caliber basically comes out and acknowledges that he's just not healthy?
Yeah, I think you have to be very concerned, because if you go into the postseason and Chris Sale is not 100%, that's your game one starter in every single playoff series you're going to play. And if you don't have that guy, then the entire rotation takes a hit. You're forcing either David Price or Rick Porcello or whomever, to move up and be even more important and go up against the other team's aces, against the Verlanders or the Klubers or, even Luis Severino, whoever the Yankees may have. It's very important. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Red Sox paid such a high price to get Chris Sale, is to have that ace going into the playoffs. It's hugely important. We saw what a difference Madison Bumgarner made in the postseason a few years ago, Corey Kluber as well. So, yeah, I think if you're the Red Sox, you're very concerned because you've got a team that certainly can win it all. Maybe it could be the favorite to win it all. But if Chris Sale is not at the top of that rotation, then all of a sudden you're extremely vulnerable and could even, be out in the first round. So, yeah, I think especially with a shoulder, those things are sometimes injuries that don't just get better in the matter, in a couple of weeks or so.
If the Nationals are one of the most disappointing teams in the NL, as great as Seattle has been this year, would the Athletics be a bigger surprise in the AL for the a simple fact that right now they're only a game back of the Houston Astros, and they're right in the thick of things?
Yeah, I think it's one of the best stories in all of baseball this season, the way that the A's have come back. And, just a month or two ago, nobody was really taking them seriously as a playoff team. And now they're challenging the mighty Houston Astros, the defending World Series champions, for that division lead and scaring the dickens out of them, I think. And they're doing it. The interesting thing to me is they're doing it with a starting rotation that includes a Trevor Cahill, Brett Anderson, Edwin Jackson. You'd think we were living in 2011 or something. These guys are still relevant. And somehow Oakland is getting.
How about Chris Davis? How about the last 3 seasons Chris Davis has had? Power numbers.
Yeah. Only player to have 40 or more home runs each of the last 3 years. I think, Chris Davis, one of those underrated players that essentially Oakland is, made a living out of collecting. And the other thing too, Rich, what's really interesting to me about Oakland is a few years ago they traded away Josh Donaldson. Mm-hmm. And, an AL MVP.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, now they've got a guy that is pretty close to the kind of player that Josh Donaldson was in Matt Chapman. I think we're going to start hearing an awful lot more about him. I think he's going to win a Gold Glove at third base in the American League. And his power hitting also, is kind of reminiscent of, Nolan Arenado-ish, if we can say that, in the American League. So this is an interesting team for sure.
Yeah, and I'll say this in closing. You mentioned Donaldson. That was it. Listen, that was a huge gamble for the Blue Jays, and it's a costly one. That was a costly bet. I mean, he's not the same player, and he's dealt with some injuries as well. So,
yeah, that's true. And he had some good years for Toronto.
No doubt.
They got very close to getting to the World Series, but just couldn't get over the hump. So I think Toronto would make that deal again, and Oakland is still in pretty good shape.
Yeah, it's fun to watch. All right, race is starting to really heat up with about a month and a half to go. I think it's great, because you've got a couple divisions that teams are running away with it, but then in the NL, it's just you can really make a case for 4 or 5 teams on why they could be in the World Series, why they could contend for a pennant, and why they can. I mean, to me, that's the beauty of baseball right now.
Most definitely. And, the Dodgers are on the, outside looking in right now, which was pretty amazing. Still, I think they may be one of, if not the most talented team in the National League. And yet, the Diamondbacks and Rockies are ahead of them in the division. And the wild card, as you mentioned, there's so many teams. And I think that's why the Nationals finally, decided to throw in the towel, because there's so many teams ahead of them. And they're all going to be playing each other going down the stretch in September. It's going to be a fun bit of chaos to observe.
Yep, absolutely. Good stuff as always, my friend. Enjoy the games. Enjoy your weekend. We will talk next week. Always appreciate a couple moments.
Sounds good. Thanks, Rich.
All right, you got it. Steve Gardner again joining us on the Boardwalk Hunt Hotline. Very good insight as always.